Welcome to the shop, my friend Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's video I'm making Loki's headpiece from the upcoming Disney Plus series, which I'm super excited about because he's one of my favorite MCU characters. Now this headpiece is made all out of my HD foam, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials, and remember, if you go through the links that are in the description section and those that are on my website, I do receive a small vendor affiliate, which allows me to continue to build awesome things like this, make free PDF files available for you, and show you how to do it. So I want to show you what it takes to put Loki's headpiece together. Let's go ahead and get started. Head on over to sksprops.com and you can download a free template for this build so you can build right along with me. I'm going to start off by transferring part A onto some 6mm HD foam. Also out of the 6mm foam you can transfer and cut out part C. Part B was transferred onto some 10mm HD foam just to give this front detail a little more depth. On the back of part A, I mark where I'm going to remove some of the foam so I can give this piece some seamless bends. I take my rotary tool and a smooth sanding drum and I round over all the edges. Then I follow the lines that I'd drawn on earlier to create a V channel on the back of the foam piece. So you'll end up with a V groove in the middle and one on either side. At this time, I also add an angle and round over part B. Here you can see the angle and the round over that I put onto part B, and I also added a small bevel to the top of part C. While part A is still a little warm, I go ahead and bend everything in upon itself. This makes it easier to manipulate the piece. Using some weldwood contact cement, I apply this generously in between all of the V grooves. After the contact cement had been allowed to dry, all the V grooves could then be pressed together. And you can see how this is a really simple shape, but those V cuts on the back give it a defined look. I lightly sketch onto part A where parts B and C need to sit. Then I can use some Bob Smith superglue to first attach the middle, just to make sure that lines up okay, and then I add some more to attach the sides. Glue can now be applied to part C and it can be pressed into place. Now if you have some gaps in between part B and part C, it's not a big deal, we're going to fill those seams later on. I take some small strips of 2mm HD foam and I superglue those to the back sides of the cheekbones. This process is done while the foam is curved to make sure that it retains this shape. I also go ahead and add a strip of 2mm foam across the forehead for the same purpose. This piece is also applied while the foam has a slight curve to it. To help strengthen the V-cuts that I have on the back of the mask, I put some 2mm foam strips over those as well. And here you can see all the little bracer strips on the back side that help this mask retain its shape. Now it's time to create the horns, and to do that I'm going to take part D and transfer that 4 times onto some 4mm HD foam. Now while you're tracing this out, you'll notice that I made some small little indication marks on the horns. These little registration points are necessary for the horns to line up just right. For the top of this horn, you're going to remove some of this material with a rotary tool, just so the tip of the horn fits together right. So what I like to do is make a small bevel on either side and then remove some of the material from the tip of the horn. And you'll see why this makes a lot more sense when we start gluing the horns together. More weldwood contact cement can now be applied to the edges of the horn pieces, as well as the section that I removed with the rotary tool. The heat from the hairdryer makes the foam a little more malleable, so I go ahead and I start to round it over. Starting at the bottom, I press my 2 pieces for the horns together. Then I flip it over and I start working my way up the back side of the horn, making sure that my registration marks are lining up. By having those registration points, you can see how you can line up and make 2 flat pieces into a curve, making up the bottom of the horn. Once I get to the top, I go back and I press all my seams together before I flip it over and work on the opposite side. Here it's the same process. I start on the bottom and I work my way up the interior, making sure that all my registration points are lining up just right. When you get to the very top, because we remove material, just press it all together to make the tip of the horn. Now there's more material here than what you're going to need. We're going to remove some of that with a rotary tool and clean up the seams. Horn shapes in general are kind of a complex curve, so if you don't get it right on the first time, don't feel bad. Remember, foam is a learning process and it's cheap, just cut some new templates and try again. Now the seams for your horns may not be all that pretty, but you'd be amazed about how much better they look after a few passes with a smooth sanding drum. And I decided to add some light striations to the horns just to give it an additional texture. So I've got my horns sanded and they look pretty good, and now I need to attach them to the headpiece. Now one of the first things that you'll notice is because the headpiece has a curve to it, the horns don't sit completely flush. So what I'm going to do is remove some of this material with my rotary tool so that the horn sits flat against the headpiece. After I sand each one of the horns, I take them and I check them for fit. Once I've determined that these horns are going to work, I lightly trace around them to make sure that I glue them and place them exactly where I want. Some Bob Smith super glue is used to attach the horns to the headpiece, and I'm constantly moving this headpiece around to make sure that the horns match and they're facing up at the correct angle. At this point, I'm really happy with how this headpiece is coming together, and it's not bad for a couple pieces of foam. At the base of each one of the horns there's a slight buildup, so I cut some strips of 2mm HD foam and I glue those wrapping around the horn. Now when I get to the very top of the horn, I cut them so they get just as close as they can. This top seam shouldn't be visible when being worn, and I'm going to try to smooth out and cover this seam with some foam clay later on. So with my headpiece complete, now I can start thinking about those finishing details like filling all my seams. The first one is quick seal, which works pretty good. The only issue I have with it is that it can't be sanded. When I want to make sure to get a smoother finish, I use my foam clay. To apply the foam clay, you first wet the foam that you're going to apply it to. And then I take some foam clay and I press it down into the seam just to try to give it a basic transition. While the foam clay is in this state, you can use some silicone tip tools or your fingers to move it around. After you have the foam clay approximately where you want it, you can then wet your finger or the tools again and help smooth it out. The smoothing process with the water actually does a pretty good job, and you may not even need to sand it later on. These little foam clay areas are pretty visible right now, but after the foam clay dries, these will be sanded smooth. Depending on the thickness of your foam clay, it could take 24 hours for it to dry. The moisture will wick out of it. Now these sections are pretty thin, so it is actually good to go the next morning. Using a sanding sponge, I start to knock down the foam clay sections until it's even with the HD foam. During this process, I end up removing almost all of the foam clay, except for the little spots where it needed to be filled. I quickly glued an elastic strap to the back of the headpiece just to check to see how it was going to look, and overall I'm really happy with the shape and scale of this headpiece. Now it's time to prime and paint, and to help me with this process I'm going to glue a scrap piece of 10mm foam to the back of the headpiece to act as a handle. Plasti Dip is going to be used as the main sealer for this prop, but you could also use products like Flex Bond or Creature Cast. This type of a spray is applied generously all over the entire headpiece, and even while parts of it are still wet, an additional coating was sprayed on top. This was then left to dry and cure for several hours. The Plasti Dip is now dry, and I'm really happy with how clean this entire headpiece looks. For paint, we're going to start off with some Krylon Red Oxide Primer. Now this is a flat primer. As you can tell, I'm dusting it onto the surface rather than applying it heavily. This is a very important process for spray paints because if you apply it too thick, they have a tendency to crack. But if you do a dusting process, the flexibility of the Plasti Dip will help that paint survive. For the main color, I'm going to be using Rust-Oleum brand Bright Coat Gold. This particular gold is extremely vibrant and a little bit goes a long way. Just like the red oxide, this is dusted onto the mask in several different layers. The other great thing about this particular prop is it really doesn't have any weathering on it, so at this point it's pretty much done. All I have left to do is attach some elastic to the back of the headpiece. For this, I'm going to be using some 3/4 inch elastic strapping, and I cut it to about 14 inches for it to fit my head, but you may need to change it for you. Some hot glue is applied to the back of the headpiece, and then the elastic is pressed firmly into it. Some additional hot glue is then applied on top of the elastic just to make sure it doesn't pull away. The only other thing you could do if you wanted to is to put a little bit of upholstery foam right here in the forehead.
So you all can see the steps that I took to put together Loki's headpiece. And remember, I have free PDF files available over on my website in case you would like to build your own. And if you're enjoying these videos, be sure to give them a thumbs up, share them with your friends and family, and until next time, build your best with the best HD foam.